Every morning in Tehran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei walked slowly through the polished halls of his residence. His steps were calm but firm. Outside, the city stirred with traffic and calls to prayer. Inside, voices whispered of new threats from Washington. Khamenei paused by a window and watched the sun rise over ancient domes. He held a cup of tea and glanced at his aides. They looked tense. Only days ago, President Trump had unveiled fresh sanctions on Iran. The news had landed like a heavy stone in still water, sending ripples through every corner of the country. In the Oval Office, Donald Trump sat behind a gleaming desk. He tapped a pen against his papers and looked at a screen showing Khamenei's face on Iranian television. Trump narrowed his eyes. He believed he was forcing Iran to yield. He believed his maximum pressure plan would push their leaders to change. He spoke on air and in tweets calling Iran's government corrupt, dangerous, and in need of reform. In Tehran, people listened to state broadcasts and read international reports. Many felt anger and pride in equal measure. Back in Tehran, Khamenei gathered his closest advisors in a small meeting room. The walls held centuries of Persian art. On a low table lay printouts of Trump's latest speech and translations of harsh tweets. A young translator pointed to a line where Trump vowed to cut off every dollar of oil revenue. An aide sighed. They all knew that more sanctions meant more hardship for ordinary Iranians. Food prices would rise, jobs would vanish. Yet they also knew that showing fear or weakness would only invite more threats. Khamenei spoke in measured tones. He reminded everyone how Iran had suffered in the past. He spoke of the 1953 coup when foreign powers toppled a democratically elected prime minister. He spoke of the revolution in 1979 when Iranians of all backgrounds rose up against a cruel king. He spoke of decades of war and struggle. Was calm but firm, like a river carving stone. He said Iran had survived worse. He asked his advisors to draft a response that would show strength without inviting violence. For the next 2 days, Khamenei worked behind closed doors. He met with translators to choose each word carefully. He met with speechwriters to shape his tone. He met with diplomats to gauge how his words might travel. In a candlelit study, he read drafts by flickering lamplight. He erased lines that sounded too soft. He struck paragraphs that felt too harsh. He wanted a balance of history and challenge. He wanted to speak not only to Iranians, but to the whole world. On the morning of his speech at the United Nations, Khamenei's aides arrived. Before dawn, they climbed into an armored car and drove through quiet streets. They carried speech notes in sealed folders. They arrived at a small private lounge at the UN headquarters. The air smelled of coffee and polished floors. Reporters and diplomats drifted past, unaware of the storm about to break. Khamenei sat quietly in a corner. He folded his hands, closed his eyes, and prayed. Then he opened his folder and read the final lines one last time. Inside the Grand Assembly Hall, world leaders filled the seats. Some wore dark suits, others wore traditional robes. Cameras lined the balconies. The hum of voices filled the room. Earlier, President Trump had finished his address. He had spoken loudly about sanctions and threats. He had used strong words. Now it was Khamenei's turn. When his name was called, he rose and walked to the podium with surprising ease. His robes brushed the red carpet. His face was calm and steady. He began in Persian, greeting fellow Muslims and extending respect to all nations. Many around him listened politely, expecting the usual warnings. Then he shifted to English. His translators repeated every word for those who could not follow Persian. He spoke about history, foreign interference, the pain inflicted on his people, and the resilience they showed. He spoke without anger in his voice, only firm conviction. He reminded the audience that Iran had suffered sanctions when it was weak, but had grown stronger because it believed in its own future. Then came the moment he had prepared for. He paused, looked across the room, and said clearly in English, "A man who brags about walls cannot break down the walls of our faith." The words echoed through the hall. At first, there was a hush as translators repeated them for those who spoke other languages. Then a ripple passed through the audience. Some reporters blinked in surprise. Some delegates leaned forward. Cameras zoomed in on faces registering shock and curiosity. Even those who disagreed could not help but notice the sharp contrast between Trump's talk of concrete walls and Khamenei's words about the deep walls of belief. Khamenei continued, explaining that faith and unity were stronger than any economic pressure. He said his people would not bow to threats, that they would build their future with knowledge and work. He spoke of hope, of young Iranians working in labs and factories, of artists and scientists determined to shape their own world. He spoke of bridges of culture and dialogue, of respect for all nations who sought peace. His speech ended with a calm plea for mutual respect and an open door to dialogue without preconditions. As he walked away from the podium, he allowed himself a small, almost hidden smile. He had delivered his message. In the back rooms, his advisors exchanged quiet nods. They knew the world would talk about those lines for days. In Tehran, state television replayed the moment again and again. In cafes, people cheered quietly or debated its meaning. Some said Khamenei had scored a victory through words alone. Others cautioned that it was only words. But all agreed it was a moment they would remember. That evening, Khamenei returned home to his quiet study. He looked out at the city lights. Of Tehran, he thought about the faces he saw at the UN, the reporters, the diplomats, the world leaders. He thought about his own people working hard under hardship, prayed for guidance and strength. He knew that words could not solve every problem, but they could change the mood of nations. He believed that a well-chosen phrase could spark hope or fear. He believed that he had spoken true. In the days that followed, Khamenei's words traveled farther than many expected. Newspapers and websites in different languages repeated the walls of faith line. Some experts called it a masterful rhetorical move. Some laughed it off as mere politics. But in Tehran, young students painted the words on walls. In small towns across Iran, families told the story at dinner tables. For a moment, a phrase became a symbol of national pride and resistance. And in the quiet moments of his study, Khamenei understood that the battle for hearts and minds was as important as any battle for land or oil. He closed his eyes and whispered a simple prayer for peace. He knew the world was full of walls, both real and imagined. He knew some walls would stand for years. Yet he believed that faith, when strong and united, could keep the spirit alive. He opened his eyes and reached for a fresh cup of tea. The night was still, but the echoes of his words still rang in the halls of power far beyond Iran's borders. In that silence, he felt the weight of history and the promise of tomorrow resting together in a single, gasping breath. ChatGPT said, "In early September, long before dawn, the streets of New York City stirred with life. Yellow taxis wove between weary buses, and early morning joggers traced the edges of Central Park. In a quiet corner of Manhattan's East Side, a modest hotel suite held a group of people who moved with purpose. They were aides and translators of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. They gathered around a small polished table, ink-stained papers spread before them. Everyone spoke in low tones, mindful of the gravity of their work. In Tehran, millions would soon watch their next move on giant television screens around the world. Diplomats and journalists would wait to see how Iran would answer President Donald Trump's harsh words from the day before. Back in Washington, the Oval Office buzzed with preparation. President Trump and his speechwriters checked every sentence for maximum impact. They wanted to keep pressure on Iran's government high. They believed their words could force Iran to make difficult choices. Late into the night, staff adjusted phrasing, tested slogans, and timed applause lines. Trump reviewed drafts on his phone, reading them aloud as he paced the room. He had decided to use the big stage of the United Nations General Assembly to remind every nation why he saw Iran as a threat. Meanwhile, in Iran's embassy to the UN, Khamenei's team watched live feeds of secret rehearsals. The translators paced the long, carpeted halls, memorizing difficult lines. They whispered tricky English phrases to each other, ensuring they would sound natural, not forced. A sense of tension ran through the small group. They understood that world opinion could shift on a single phrase. They knew the stakes were high. On the morning of the General Assembly, Khamenei's aides arrived at Iran's designated room in the UN complex before the sun had fully risen. The building felt enormous and hollow at that hour. Marble floors gleamed under chandelier lights. Security guards stood silent at every entrance. Inside the room, the walls were lined with flags of every member nation. It felt like the world gathered under one roof, all waiting for voices to shape the coming days. Khamenei himself did not travel to New York. He chose instead to send a recorded message and to appear by video link. This allowed him to speak directly, without the sunken eyes and rushed tone that sometimes come from long flights. Hours before his address, technicians checked microphones and cameras. Lighting was adjusted so that his face would appear clear and steady. Khamenei, dressed in simple robes and a black turban, sat before a green velvet curtain. He opened a folder of notes, looked into the camera, and took a deep breath. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of decades. Across town at the General Assembly Hall, delegates filed into their seats. Some greeted neighbors, others checked messages on phones. The hall rose to a hushed murmur as President Trump stepped to the podium. He began with proud tones about American strength and freedom. He criticized Iran by name, calling its leaders corrupt and dangerous. He spoke of economic sanctions that would cut oil revenues to zero. Cameras panned the audience. Some nodded in agreement, others furrowed their brows. Trump's speech moved in sharp blocks of text, each sentence designed to land a blow. He ended by urging nations to stand with America until Iran changed or paid a heavy price. No sooner had Trump left the stage than Iranian state media began airing Khamenei's response live. In Tehran, families gathered around television screens. In coffee shops, students murmured prayers before they listened. Across the Persian Gulf, in Dubai cafes and Doha offices, people switched channels and leaned closer to the speakers. The world seemed to hold its breath. On screen, Khamenei spoke in Persian before shifting to English. His tone was quiet, almost gentle, but every word carried weight. He began with history, how foreign forces had divided Iran, how sanctions had hurt ordinary families, how the nation had endured wars and uprisings. He spoke of teachers and doctors, of farmers and factory workers, people whose lives were shaped by economic hardship. He did not raise his voice, did not point fingers. He spoke simply, like a storyteller who trusted his audience to feel the truth behind each sentence. Subtle nods from his team back in Tehran signaled that the live feed was clear. Translators repeated his words to those who could not follow Persian, and the two versions echoed in harmony. As he reached the heart of his message, the room on the other side of the world grew silent. Khamenei paused, as if gathering all the tension in the hall, then delivered a line he had honed with care. A man who brags about walls cannot break. Down the walls of our faith, cameras froze on shocked faces. Some delegates blinked, others whispered translations to neighbors, and reporters reached instinctively for their notebooks. In the back of the hall, diplomats from Europe exchanged astonished glances. A seasoned ambassador from France tapped his pen on a folder and murmured, "That was unexpected." An African delegate leaned over and asked his neighbor, "Did he just compare our belief to a wall?" Memes and reaction videos began to ripple across social media before the feed had even ended. Khamenei continued with personal stories of a young engineer who refused to leave the country, of a mother selling homemade crafts to support her children, of a teacher writing poems about hope. He spoke not of hatred or revenge, but of resilience and unity. Back in Tehran, state television replayed the speech on loop. University students gathered in dorm lounges to debate the meaning of that key line. Shopkeepers wrote it on chalkboards outside their stores. In a quiet neighborhood mosque, an imam recited Khamenei's words as part of Friday prayers and invited worshippers to reflect on the power of faith. The phrase "walls of our faith" became a rallying cry, painted in bright colors on walls, near the Grand Bazaar. Meanwhile, in Washington, White House aides scrambled to craft a reply. Some urged a sarcastic tweet, others a stern news conference. But Trump's team worried that any response would only draw more attention to Khamenei's poignant remark. They debated whether to ignore it or to issue a statement, calling it empty rhetoric. Press briefings became heated as reporters demanded a reaction. American newspapers ran headlines like Supreme Leader's sharp retort steals on show and Trump's wall talk meets a poetic rebuttal. Throughout the day, analysts around the world weighed in. A respected political scientist on British television called it a masterstroke in rhetorical strategy. A Middle East correspondent in Cairo said it would challenge the narrative. Of Iran's isolation, an American talk show host argued that Trump had been outmatched on the world stage, yet others dismissed it as a clever line with little practical effect. Still, they all agreed that words can shift perceptions, sometimes more quickly than troops or tanks. When evening fell in Tehran, Khamenei's team gathered again, this time to review international reactions. They studied translated articles, social media posts, and television clips. Everyone smiled when they saw children reciting the line in elementary schools. They noted the cautious praise from some moderate voices abroad. Even hardliners admitted that the remark had resonated. Beyond Iran's borders, Khamenei, watching from his study, allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. He had prepared this line like a piece of fine calligraphy, and now the world was reading it. In the days that followed, the speech continued to reverberate. European negotiators used the phrase when discussing sanctions relief. A New Zealand senator quoted it in a parliamentary debate. A university in Brazil invited an Iranian scholar to speak about the role of faith in politics and culture. Even in conservative circles in the United States, some commentators called for a reassessment of America's approach. For Khamenei and his people, the impact went deeper. The line became a symbol of national pride, a reminder that, in the face of adversity, words can build bridges as sturdy as any wall. It did not end the conflict, nor did it erase suffering. But it shifted the conversation. It showed that when chosen with care, phrases can become tools of influence, capable of lifting spirits and challenging assumptions. And so, as part 2 of this unfolding story closes, the stage is set for a new chapter. The world has witnessed a clash of words, each side hoping to shape history. Yet for a moment, those quiet voices from Tehran cut through the noise and left listeners around the globe truly gasping. In the next act, we'll see how both sides respond to this unexpected turn and whether that single line will endure as a turning point, or fade into the background of diplomatic conflict. The morning after Khamenei's video address, the world seemed to hum with renewed energy. In Tehran, shopkeepers switched on their lights and flipped through newspapers. Television screens in public squares aired clips of the supreme leaders. Memorable phrase over and over. Elsewhere, in London cafes, patrons hunched over laptops scrolling through articles. In New Delhi office towers, analysts paused their meetings to hear news bulletins. The line, "A man who brags about walls cannot break down the walls of our faith," had spread like wildfire, leaving journalists and commentators scrambling for reaction. Inside newsrooms from Paris to Buenos Aires, editors raced to include the quote in headlines. A morning anchor in Rome read the line slowly, enunciating each word so viewers could feel its weight. In Sydney, a radio host played the English version and then switched to Persian to capture the original rhythm. Social media platforms filled with animated GIFs of stone walls crumbling into dust, overlaid with Khamenei's words. Memes sprang up overnight. One showed a cartoon Trump building a brick wall, only to have a flock of tiny hearts topple it. Another showed an open book labeled Faith forming an unbreakable barrier around a group of people in Tehran's Grand Bazaar. Merchants chalked the phrase on blackboards outside their shops. A carpet seller wrote it in bold Persian script, then added a small English translation underneath. Browsing customers read the words out loud, nodding and murmuring approval. A tea seller poured sweet saffron tea into delicate cups as he told a friend he felt proud. "This line is not just words," he said. "It shows our strength." In university classrooms, professors paused lectures on economics or literature to ask students what they thought. Hands shot up. Some said it was a clever piece of rhetoric. Others said it reminded them of Iran's long history of resisting outside pressure. Most agreed it lifted their spirits. At Iran's embassy near the UN, aides watched a compilation of global media clips. They saw European politicians quoting the line in speeches. They saw a university debate in Canada, where students argued its meaning. They saw commentators in South Africa calling it poetic, and analysts in Russia calling it unexpectedly sharp. Each new mention felt like a small victory, a sign that Iran's voice had cut through the noise of world affairs. Back in Washington, reaction was mixed. In the White House briefing room, reporters pressed for a response. Press secretary read a prepared statement, calling the remark empty rhetoric and accusing Iran of playing games. Some Republican lawmakers praised the administration for keeping up pressure on Iran. Some Democrats called for renewed diplomacy, saying that the harsh rhetoric on both sides risked real conflict. Late-night talk show hosts seized on the moment. One joked that Trump's next tweet might be my wall versus their faith, while another quipped about a faith-building exercise rather than a wall-building exercise. The jokes kept headlines light, but the seriousness lingered beneath. The laughter, internationally, the effect went beyond headlines. In Brussels, European foreign ministers discussed whether to offer a limited easing of sanctions in return for talks. They debated whether Khamenei's speech signaled a real willingness to negotiate or simply a bid to gain sympathy. A German diplomat noted that while the line had power, it did not change Iran's nuclear activities or its role in regional conflicts. Still, she admitted it had softened some attitudes toward engaging Iran. In Tokyo, business leaders considered the possibility of investing in Iran if sanctions eased. They wondered whether the moment of cultural diplomacy could translate into economic opportunity. In Tehran, ordinary citizens felt a renewed sense of unity. A young engineer named Leela walked to her university lab with a small poster taped to her backpack. It bore the English quote in neat letters. She felt the words were personal, as if Khamenei had spoken directly to her and her friends. In the lab, she shared the poster with classmates. They discussed its meaning over microscopes and circuit boards. Some said it gave them courage to keep working despite hardship. Others said it reminded them that their work was part of something larger story of resilience. In a small cafe near the University of Tehran, a barista named Hassan switched on the television at 6 a.m. He brewed strong, dark coffee as he watched a young interviewer ask an American expert whether the phrase would matter. The expert said lyrical lines can shape opinion, but real change came from agreements and actions. Hassan nodded and scribbled the quote on a napkin. When the cafe filled with students, he showed them. They read it, laughed, and then grew silent, letting the words sink in. Then they went back to their studies, carrying the phrase in their minds. Meanwhile, regional neighbors took note. In Ankara, Turkish newspapers ran the line under photographs of Khamenei and world leaders. In Beirut, a political talk show debated whether Iran's cultural influence could outlast sanctions. In Kabul, university students posted the phrase on classroom walls as a lesson in the power of language. Even in distant Canberra, a professor of Middle East history included the line in a lecture on diplomatic communication, telling students, it showed how a single sentence can echo across continents. Within Iran's government, the speech emboldened some factions and worried others. Hardliners praised Khamenei's defiance, saying it proved the regime stood strong. Moderates worried it would make real negotiation harder. In closed-door meetings, officials argued over next steps. Some urged using this momentum to seek talks. Under new conditions, others urged caution, fearing that any sign of compromise would look like weakness after such a bold statement. Khamenei himself watched developments from his study. He saw both pride and concern. He knew that, after a powerful phrase, actions mattered even more than words. As days passed, a documentary crew arrived in Tehran to capture public reaction. They filmed graffiti artists painting the quote in vibrant colors on a long wall. They filmed children reciting it in school classrooms. They filmed families discussing it over dinner. In one scene, a grandmother in a simple headscarf whispered the line to her granddaughter, explaining that faith could withstand any challenge. In another, a young man on his bicycle read it aloud as he pedaled through a park. The documentary montage showed how deeply the words had seeped into daily life. At the same time, Iran's state media prepared to hold a televised debate. Anchors invited scholars, poets, and historians to discuss the phrase. One poet said it had the rhythm of a poem, balancing consonants and meaning. A historian traced echoes of similar expressions in Iran's past. Sociologists spoke of how shared slogans can build social cohesion. The debate drew high viewership, with callers phoning in to share their thoughts. Many said it made them feel connected to a broader narrative of persistence and pride. On social media, a group of young volunteers launched a campaign called #WallsOfFaith. They encouraged Iranians abroad to film themselves saying the phrase in their native tongues. Videos appeared from Iran, Canada, Australia, and beyond. Each clip showed someone holding a small sign with the English line, then speaking in Persian, Spanish, Urdu, or French. The hashtag trended for days in Iran and briefly trended in several other countries. It became a symbol of cultural solidarity, more than a political slogan. In the halls of power in Washington, even some skeptics admitted the phrase had bite. A congressional aide whispered to a reporter that they would have to be careful not to dismiss it outright. Underestimating such moments could allow the opposition to gain psychological advantage. At a strategic think tank, an expert held up a slide with the quote and asked, "What do we do now?" The room fell quiet. They knew rhetorical victories did not win wars, but they shaped minds guide policy. In Iran's foreign ministry, diplomats drafted a letter to the UN Secretary General. They quoted Khamenei's line as evidence of their commitment to dialogue built on mutual respect. They proposed a preliminary meeting with European mediators to explore confidence-building measures. The letter was polite, to the point, and carried the same calm conviction as the speech. It landed on desks in New York, Geneva, and Vienna, inviting fresh conversation. As part 3 of this story draws to a close, the world stands at a crossroads of words and actions. Khamenei's phrase has traveled farther than many expected, has lifted spirits, sparked debates, and drawn attention to the old versus the new walls of concrete versus walls of conviction. Yet beneath this moment of rhetorical triumph lies a deeper question. Will words alone change behavior, or must they be backed by choices that shape the future? The answer will unfold in the coming chapters, where both sides weigh their next moves in the ongoing dance of diplomacy and power. In the days after Khamenei's speech at the UN, his words continued to spread around the world. In Tehran, a crowd gathered outside the city's biggest television station. People clapped and cheered as they heard the line, "A man who brags about walls cannot break down the walls of our faith," over and over on the giant screen. A schoolteacher raised her voice above the crowd and asked her students to repeat the phrase. The children spoke clearly, their small voices carrying hope and pride. Families standing nearby smiled and whispered to each other about how those words made them feel strong. Far away in London, a news reporter stood on a busy street corner. He held a small microphone and asked passersby what they thought of Khamenei's line. A young artist paused as she walked by. She said it sounded like a poem. She sketched a quick picture of a brick wall with birds flying over it. A taxi driver nodded and said the words showed that belief can be more powerful than money or guns. The reporter turned to the camera and said that, for many, these simple words had more impact than any heavy speech full of threats. In Paris, a cafe near the River Seine filled with students and writers. They sat at round tables under soft lights and drank coffee as they argued about what the phrase really meant. One student said it was a sign that Iran had many wise people. Another said it was dangerous to compare faith to walls. A poet scribbled the line on a napkin and added a drawing of an unbreakable fortress of light. They ordered more coffee and talked late into the night. Their voices rose and fell like a song as they searched for meaning in a few simple words. In New York City, where the speech had been heard first, a group of diplomats met in a small conference room. They wore dark suits and sat around a polished table. A European ambassador opened a folder of translated articles. She pointed to headlines. In several languages, they all carried the same phrase. One diplomat said it showed that diplomacy was not only about rules and deals, but also about trust and respect. Another diplomat added that words can change the mood of a room as soon as you speak them. They agreed to pass the phrase along to their foreign offices and to watch how it might affect talks. At a university in Cairo, students posted the line on the walls of their dormitory. They painted it in bright colors, with flowers and stars around the letters. They took pictures and shared them online. Soon, similar photos appeared from students in Karachi, Manila, and Madrid. Hashtag Walls of Faith began to trend on social media. Videos showed people in different countries holding up signs with the English words. They smiled and spoke in many languages, but all spoke the same line. The simple act of sharing these videos felt like a quiet protest against division and fear. In a small town in southern Italy, a group of farmers gathered at a local community hall. It had little to do with world politics, but they had heard the words on the radio after the evening news. One farmer said he felt moved by the idea that belief in unity could be stronger than any power. His neighbor, an older woman who sold eggs at the market, said she would write the line on her barn door. Others nodded and decided to hang a small plaque with the phrase by the front gate. They said it would remind them every morning to stay kind and brave. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Trump's team felt the ripples of the speech. They saw headlines mocking walls and praising faith. Some advisors wanted to fire back with stronger words. Others warned that a battle of words could harm America's image if it looked like bullying. Reporters asked on live TV what the president would say next. Trump paused, then posted a tweet about America's strength and determination. He did not mention faith or walls. He shifted the focus back to trade and jobs. His supporters cheered. But many on social media pointed out the contrast to Khamenei's poetic line. In Berlin, the German foreign minister spoke at a press conference. She quoted Khamenei's phrase as an example of how language can bridge cultures. She called for calm dialogue and said her country would work to ease tensions. Journalists in the room scribbled notes. Some wrote about possible shifts in Europe's approach to Iran. Others wrote about the power of soft words. The minister's speech ended with a call to remember the human side of politics. She urged hope and understanding, echoing the very theme of Walls of Faith. Back in Tehran, Khamenei watched these events unfold on a small television in his study. His advisors stood behind him, reading translated reports. He did not smile broadly or laugh. He merely nodded, as if satisfied that his message had reached far corners of the globe. Then he turned to his prayer rug, knelt, and spoke quietly. He gave thanks for the chance to speak truth. He prayed for peace and wisdom for all leaders. After a few minutes, he rose and returned to his desk, where he began writing notes for future speeches. In an Australian high school, a teacher showed her class a clip of Khamenei's speech. She asked her students to talk about the role of faith in their own lives. A shy boy raised his hand and said faith could be belief in family and friends. A girl added that faith could be love for music or art. The teacher wrote their ideas on the board, connecting them to the idea that faith can build invisible walls of support around people. The students nodded and whispered that simple words can unlock deep thoughts. In Lagos, Nigeria, a community radio station aired a special program. Voices from different faiths spoke about the phrase. A pastor, and a imam, and a priest discussed how walls appear in hearts and minds when people fear each other. They said walls of faith could also divide if faith becomes a tool for hate. They offered a call for unity, urging listeners to build walls of understanding instead. The radio host ended the show by reading the lines slowly, letting it hang in. The quiet studio before the music began. At a technology conference in Tokyo, startup founders spoke about building online networks for education. She mentioned how a single phrase from a global leader could go viral. She used Khamenei's line as an example of how ideas can travel faster than any software. The audience clapped. Investors in the room saw a lesson. Content is as important as technology. They talked among themselves about sponsoring digital platforms that promote positive messages. They saw that one sentence can spark new ventures. In Manila, a youth group organized a mural project. Young artists painted the line in bold letters on a wall near a bustling street. They added images of hands reaching out and hearts glowing. Passers-by paused to read and to snap photos. Some even joined in, painting small flowers and leaves around the words. A local newspaper ran a story about the mural, calling it a sign that young people wanted peace and unity. The artists felt proud, believing their work would inspire others to think beyond fear. In Rio de Janeiro, a samba school prepared its show for Carnival. Choreographers decided to include the phrase in their float decorations. They built a wall of light blocks that opened to reveal dancers dressed in bright colors. As the float moved down the street, spectators cheered. They held signs with the English words, and many sang along to a samba beat. The music and dance gave new life to the line, turning it into a celebration rather than a challenge. People felt joy and unity, proving that words can also bring smiles. Throughout all these places, one truth became clear. Khamenei's words had opened a door. He did not change every policy or remove every threat. He did not end conflicts or lift every sanction. But through a simple phrase, he showed that language can shape how people think and feel. Walls of stone can divide, but walls of belief can unite. Whether heard in a crowded street, a quiet radio studio, or on a painted wall, the phrase traveled far beyond its origin. And so, as this part of the story draws to a close, the world stands at a new moment. The echo of those words remains in markets, schools, and streets. People of many nations have seen how a few carefully chosen words can spark hope, debate, and even art. They have learned that messages matter, that sometimes the greatest victories come not from force, but from the power of faith shared across invisible walls. In the weeks after that powerful speech at the United Nations, life in Iran settled into a new rhythm. In Tehran, the grand mosques still called the faithful to prayer, and the bazaars still hummed with bargaining voices. Yet beneath the everyday bustle, people carried a spark of something fresh. On city walls, murals reminded passers-by of walls of faith. On small tea houses, friends leaned close over steaming cups, replaying the moment Khamenei's voice spoke across the world. They spoke not only of pride but also of possibilities that hard words might yield to honest talks. Across the sea, in Europe, diplomats quietly explored those possibilities. In Vienna, a meeting room glowed under soft lamps as delegates from several nations gathered around a long table. A French ambassador opened notes and spoke gently of finding common ground. An Italian negotiator added that the phrase from Tehran had inspired many to rethink their stance. Even a British envoy, cautious and reserved, admitted that the line about faith had a poetic power beyond simple slogans. They spoke late into the night, crafting tentative proposals for limited meeting stocks. About farming aid, cultural exchanges, and small economic relief for humanitarian goods. It was a cautious start, but it felt different from the usual list of demands. In the United States, reactions ranged from prideful defiance to cautious curiosity. Trump focused on elections and domestic issues, mentioned the speech only once. In a press conference, he called it pretty words, but added that actions mattered more than speeches. His aides drafted a public note offering to send diplomats for talks on matters of global security. Iran would show real change. Some critics in Washington said this was too weak a response, while others said it was a sensible step. Toward avoiding greater conflict, opinion columns debated whether it was better to ignore poetic lines or to seize on them as openings for dialogue. Meanwhile, ordinary Iranians felt a mix of hope and skepticism. A shop assistant named Sarah wrote the key phrase on a small chalkboard in her window. Tourists snapping pictures asked what it meant. She smiled and explained that it showed how belief could unite a people. But when they asked if this would change, life bring more jobs or cheaper bread, she shrugged with a soft smile and said, "Words open doors. Then we must walk through them ourselves." Many agreed. They saw that while the phrase had moved hearts, real life still demanded hard work teaching children. Fixing broken cars, cooking meals, designing new medicines, in a quiet study not far from the Grand Bazaar, Khamenei considered the unfolding days. He read translated press reports and watched videos of interviews. He saw smiles in Tehran and hopeful faces in European capitals. He saw skeptical frowns in Washington, He felt that his words had done their part. Now it was time for actions. He met with his advisors and directed them to plan modest steps, send a delegation of scientists to a European conference, invite cultural groups from other countries too. Tehran discussed building a small health clinic with international support. He believed that trust built piece by piece would matter more than big breakthroughs overnight. In schools across Iran, teachers used this moment as a lesson. In a dusty village classroom, a teacher named Reza wrote the phrase on the chalkboard and asked his students what they thought. A young girl said it felt like hope. A boy said it felt like strength. Reza nodded and asked them to draw pictures of walls made of different things: stones, steel, and then invisible walls like love, knowledge, and faith. The children colored bright pictures, sharing stories of how kind words had helped them in hard times. Many said they would remember that line when they faced challenges, small or large. Beyond Iran's borders, artists and writers found new inspiration. In Berlin, a poet wrote a short poem that began with the line, "A man who brags," about walls. She sent it to a friend in Tehran, who translated it back into Persian. A young filmmaker in Mumbai made a short video montage of people of different faiths smiling and holding hands, ending with the same phrase. In Cape Town, a jazz musician composed a brief melody that captured the rise and fall of voices saying the words. These creative efforts did not solve political problems. They spread the message that walls, whether of concrete or of fear, could break when hearts opened to each other. Historians began to take note. In a university office in London, a professor of Middle East history arranged his collection of speeches and books on a shelf. He added a new file labeled 2019 UN speech. He planned to write an article about how a single phrase had entered global discussions, compared it to other famous lines in history, noting that powerful words often came at times of tension. Wondered whether this moment would mark a genuine turning point or remain a footnote in the long story of conflict. In diplomacy. Either way. He believed it would teach students about the lasting power of well-chosen words. In small diplomatic backchannels, real conversations began. Iranian and European envoys met in a sunny conference room over tea and fruit. Quietly of shared interests, protecting cultural heritage, promoting university exchanges, addressing climate change in arid lands. Some topics were sensitive, but they agreed to keep talking. They drafted a letter to the UN Secretary-General proposing a limited visit of humanitarian aid to drought-hit regions in Iran. Neither side knew if it would go far, but they believed. Each small step mattered. Meanwhile, in the United States Congress, a group of lawmakers introduced a bipartisan resolution. It acknowledged the power of words and urged support for cultural exchanges and dialogues that build bridges rather than walls. Some called it a symbolic gesture. Others called it a first step toward easing tensions that had lasted for decades. In committee meetings, aides debated the wording, careful to recognize shared concerns over security, while also praising the call for mutual respect. The resolution passed in the House by a narrow margin and moved to the Senate. On the streets of Tehran, life went on. Street cleaners swept dust from curbs. A baker kneaded dough for morning bread. A young couple took wedding photos beneath an arch decorated with flowers and the phrase, "Walls of Faith," painted in gold. They laughed as the photographer asked them to hold hands and look at each other, reminding them that walls fall when people open their hearts. In a quiet home nearby, an elderly man read poetry to his grandchildren, ending with Khamenei's words as a reminder that faith is a fortress no walls can breach. As the sun set on this chapter of the story, people everywhere pondered what had changed. Some said only words had shifted, while others said those words would shape actions for years to come. Khamenei's phrase had echoed across continents and cultures. It had sparked debates, inspired art, and opened doors, small doors perhaps, but doors nonetheless. In moments of quiet reflection, many realized that the true measure of walls lies not in their bricks or stones, but in what they keep in and what they keep out of the human heart. And so the story continues, carried forward by the choices of many leaders, artists, teachers, and ordinary people. The walls of faith remain standing, invisible but strong, reminding all who listen that belief in unity can build bridges where division once stood. Only time will tell how far this message will travel, but for now, it has changed at least this. When people speak of walls, they will remember that a man who boasts of walls cannot break down the walls of faith that bind a people together.